This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello and welcome to Dialogue. On this day 50 years ago, leaders of China and Japan normalized diplomatic ties, opening a new chapter in the relationship between the two countries. Now the two neighbors face new political and security challenges despite the closer economic ties. How do the two countries view each other? How will they deal with the challenges? And what lies ahead in the next 50 years for Asia's two largest economies? For these questions and more, I'm glad to be joined today by Professor Gui Yuntao of the School of International Studies in Peking University, Benoit Hardy-Chartrand, Adjunct Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at Temple University in Japan, and Takesato Watanabe, Professor Emeritus of Doshisha University. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Welcome to the discussion. Yuntao, I will start with you. When people talk about the establishment of the diplomatic relations between China and Japan 50 years ago in 1972, people often spoke of this wisdom, the vision, this sense of strategy, for the leaders from the two countries. Why people, think so highly of this forging or normalization of this relationship in 1972?
Well, the normalization 50 years ago was achieved on the one hand by in a top-down manner by the top decision makers of both countries with strategic vision against the backdrop of the U.S.-China reconciliation in the early 1970s, which was a major structural change during the Cold War. While on the other hand, this normalization was also driven by people-to-people or grassroots diplomacy between Japan and China, in which many people across the ocean have made every effort in terms of business exchanges, cultural exchanges, to try to restore the relations that was broken immediately after the Second World War. So after more than 20 years of effort by both grassroots people and top decision makers, the two countries finally overcome the difficulties and obstacles at the time and realized the normalization.
Benoit, how do you characterize the current relationship between China and Japan, the largest two economies in Asia? Obviously, seems to me they have their own complaints about the other side, probably on specific issues too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are a lot of up and downs in the China-Japan relationship. If you look at the beginning of last decade, in the early 2010, we probably reached the lowest point in the history of China-Japan relations since normalization in 1972. That happened in 2012 after the nationalization by the Japanese government of the islands in the East China Sea. And that very bad relationship lasted from about 2012 to more or less 2016. There were 4 years of very harsh rhetoric on both sides. Since then, things improved a little bit. There was a possibility around 2019-20 of a visit by President Xi Jinping to Japan. This obviously did not materialize because of the pandemic that emerged in early 2020. So at this moment, we are in a situation where it's still relatively frosty for various reasons. As you mentioned, both sides have complaints about the other side. These complaints seem to be very difficult to reconcile at the moment. But at the very least, they're still able to maintain basic working relationships, and we have not gone back to the very high tensions that I mentioned a second ago of the early 2010s.
If you look at the history, over the past 50 years between China and Japan, one factor often affecting this bilateral relationship is this historical issues, which is sensitive, Japan, 50 years ago, earlier, because of during the Second World War, let's say, occupied and even colonized, for example, the Korean Peninsula, and in a brutal way, let's say. So that has left the scar, a historical scar on many Asian nations, including China, and of course, occasional visit by the Japanese officials of the Yasukuni Shrine, which is very controversial too. Every time there will be some let's say, protest or some criticism from either South Korea or China, both countries actually. But again, is this still, the sense is like it is not the biggest stumbling block anymore between the two countries. Is that the sense for people who are following these events, studying the history between two countries?
Yes, absolutely.
Well,
I think
I believe that.
Sorry, Yuntao, please. Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I believe that this so-called history issue has been a particular diplomatic as well as public opinion question between China and Japan. It adds an emotional dimension to this bilateral relationship and making it much more difficult for diplomats or governments to manage their bilateral relations if it is the otherwise. So I think that even when more than 70 years have passed since the end of the Second World War, the history issue remains a sensitive issue between these two countries, especially when we look at the public opinion, including the views on the internet these days, which would spread quickly and arouse emotional responses across the world. So I think that the two countries still needs to carefully manage this sensitive issue. And in particular, politicians in Japan should continue and adhere to what Japan has agreed, has come to terms with the responsibility of Japan during the war. And as it is stated clearly in the joint statement 50 years ago, when the two countries normalized their relations, Japan admitted its responsibility during the war, in which it caused severe damages to the people in Asia, and Japan also reapproaches itself when it comes to the view of the history. And this is what we say a foundation, a political foundation for the stability and development of the bilateral relations.
One of the key issues between the two countries. Now we have Professor Watanabe on the line. Professor, welcome to discussion. What do you make of this relationship between China and Japan, in particular over the past 50 years since the two countries normalized their relationship in 1972?
So many Japanese have a very good impression of China and Chinese people, especially after the normalization of the diplomatic relations. But remember that normalization of the relations realized because of the 1 year former year, the Japan organized the World Table Tennis Championships. And through this sports event, China invited, in Nagoya, Japan, United States team to China. And the United States and China were so severely against each other. And Japan joined at the same time with America. But sports changed so much. Sports radically changed world order. So this is one hint that if the China and Japan have this kind of the events again, we may have the better relations. Of course, the Taiwan matter is very delicate for Americans, but for Japan or Japanese people, Taiwan matter issue is not so serious because more than half of the Japanese believe that Taiwan should belong to mainland China. So this is very delicate on the newspapers. But always, whenever I ask my students, they say that Taiwan is one of the part of China. So this kind of the things show a little different aspects of the international relations.
We'll touch upon this Taiwan issue later on. But if you look at the past 50 years, Yongtao, one very important issue is really the many changes took place. One change is like, for example, Japan used to be the largest economy in Asia. But since 2010, China surpassed Japan in terms of the size of the economy. And many expect China's GDP would be 4 times that of Japan at the end of this year. Some believe that kind of change probably produces some negative attitudes in Japan for some people. They need some time to adapt to the new reality. Does that make sense?
Well, I
Please.
think that the Japanese view of China's rapid growth has been, sort of divided at this moment or in recent years. On the one hand, many Japanese people may view China's rapid growth as simply a natural development because of China's economic policy as well as China's population and China's integration with the global market. On the other hand, there are also many Japanese who believe that this change has been too rapid and they are psychologically feeling uncomfortable to a very powerful China confronting Japan, especially when these people emphasize the security competition or the disputes over history, over territorial issues. They find that the growing power of China may pose potentially a challenge to Japan. So that is sort of understandable. I think that so it's basically not only a change in reality, but also necessitate a change in the psychological response to this kind of major changes.
Professor Watanabe, what do you make of this change? And what is say mainstream opinions of the Japanese people about the rapid rise of China?
As far as I know from the statistical data on the newspapers or governmental organizations, the Japanese ordinary people, they have the good image about China and Chinese people because all the students from primary school to university, they can write kanji Chinese characters. And also, in many times, Japanese dramas, you see, talk about China and Chinese, including the Taiwan people. You see, they like the China so much, but as far as the politics is concerned, the aspect is a little different. But generally speaking, or as a whole, Japanese people like Chinese people, and they express thanks toward Chinese people and China. But they don't understand, most of them, they don't understand the communism. What is communism? I visited China more than 20 times, and I joined the ping-pong diplomacy 50 years ago. On the next year of the ping-pong diplomacy, Japan and China and United States, China normalized the diplomatic relations. So it was so easy for the Japanese people to change the understanding, even politically. So this is very important. But mass media want to talk about the severe, struggles between the two, or severe political fighting between the two. I mean that the Japanese government or Chinese government sometimes. But generally, the general public, they like China and Chinese. So it is not so serious problem. But America want to go into this power struggles because of the national defenses for themselves. So most of the Japanese people like to have the increase of the trading between Japan and China. So I don't severely worry about those things.
Benoit, here are a couple of issues actually. On one hand, of course, China-Japan relationship is a bit different from China-the U.S. For example, the U.S. is very much concerned about the loss of number one status, preeminent status globally. But for Japan, more or less, despite some psychological effect, basically people accept the rise of China. But still, there are some issues. When it comes to the opinion polls, they see a lot of increasing attitudes, negative attitudes about China on the Chinese side too. So, what are the factors? In what way probably we can improve the understanding of each other, and then we can form a proper understanding, a proper perception of each other?
Right, indeed. I think that's a very important question. The opinion polls, public opinion, has been very interesting to follow, to say the least, since normalization in 1972. Things have changed a lot, however, when it comes to public opinion. If you look at surveys of Japanese public opinion in the 1970s and 80s, opinions of China were extremely positive. The word that was used in Japanese was shinkinkan, affinity, how much affinity Japanese people felt for China, and the numbers went up to about 80% in the 1970s, not long after normalization. So this was a period, this was called the golden era of Sino-Japanese relations. Things unfortunately really started going down and declining in the 1990s, and even more so in the 2000s and 2010. And if you look at more recent opinion polls that are conducted by organizations both in China as well as in Japan, you see that opinions on both sides have significantly declined. There are various reasons for that. If you look at Chinese public opinion, again, looking at the data from the surveys, one of the reasons that Chinese people have a negative view of Japan is the perception that Japan has not sufficiently apologized for the aggression of World War II and before World War II. They also talk about the situation in the East China Sea, which is another reason why Chinese people hold negative views of Japan. On the other hand, if you look at public opinion, and again, I'm talking here about surveys from the last few years, the survey, or rather the questioners, they ask people what are the reasons behind their perceptions of China. What comes up very often is not only the situation in the East China Sea, but also the perception in Japan that China, certain actions by China go against international rules. That's the second reason that is most often said in those surveys. And finally, the third one is the fact that for Japanese people, they feel that the country has sufficiently apologized for the past. So if you take all of this together, you see that these are perceptions that are somewhat difficult to reconcile. And part of your question was, how do we change this situation? How do we improve public opinion in both China and Japan? I don't think that's an easy task. I think that's going to require quite a lot more efforts on both sides in terms of the media, in terms of education. Of course, there needs to be more education, more awareness in Japan of the past. There needs to be better understanding in China of the way that Japan feels about the issue, and that would help. But in the short term, it would be somewhat difficult to imagine a reversal of the current situation, but I do have hope for the midterm to long-term future.
Do have hope for the long-term, midterm future. Yuntao, if you look at this China-Japan relationship, there's a factor, obviously, the U.S., because Japan is a close ally of the United States. When the U.S. is having a problem with China, for example, in their term, strategic competition with China, basically a containment policy against China, of course, they will recruit the efforts from Japan against China. In that way, Japan will be affected or will be pushed in that direction against China. So you can see the Japanese response on the issues of Taiwan issue, just like the forging of the normalization of a relationship in 1972. That was also partly affected probably because of the detente between China and the United States. So Japan and China could forge that kind of relationship.
Well, I think that at least there are two aspects to this relationship between Japan and China on one hand and the U.S. factor on the other hand. If you look at the economic aspect, I think that for the moment, both Japan and China have been pretty much realistic, rational, and careful in managing their relations. A major difference between Sino-Japanese economic relations and that between China and the United States is that the U.S. sees its economic relationship with China in these days as a zero-sum competition. While there are competition between China and Japan as well, but neither Japan or China see their economic relationship in the manner of a zero-sum game. So it's mutually beneficial. But the other aspect, the security or political aspect, concerns us a lot recently because we find that Japan, at least some Japanese politicians, are buying the theory, the containment theory from the United States, and try to, let's say, put pressure on some sensitive issues, including particularly the Taiwan question between China and the United States and Japan. So I think that these provocative remarks and actions recently coming from some Japanese politicians has added much uncertainty and potential instability between these two countries. It is exactly due to this kind of sensitivity and the importance of this kind of issue that we should recall the history 50 years ago when the two countries, although standing in different camps during the Cold War, can still manage to agree on how to carefully control the differences between them and look at their bilateral relations in the let's say future-oriented rather than politically motivated view. I think that kind of strategic vision and political courage is highly needed in today's Japan-China relations.
Mm-hmm. Well, Benoit, obviously, it is. A big decision need to be made at the top level of leadership is between the two countries. But on the in the public sector, at least you can see when people quote like ideological differences, like differences in political systems, to complain or to have a negative perception about China. But look, China has been a socialist country. Say in 1972, the two countries normalized the relationship, and China still is a socialist country. China hasn't changed, but somehow people's perception has changed. Do you see this kind of influence, from the U.S., from Washington? Somehow, the world is divided between black and white, democracy and non-Western democracy, between good and evil. That kind of dichotomy. This is no good. I mean, it's just dividing the world, basically.
Well, there's no doubt that the United States has some influence.
Benoit, please go ahead.
Yeah, well, there's no doubt that in terms of the United States and its relations with Japan, the United States and policymakers in Washington and the White House do have some influence over the views of the Japanese policymakers, and to some extent, generally, American policy in the region towards China also has an influence on Japanese perceptions of China. No doubt about that. And I think you made a very good point about the fact that, of course, in 1972, when the normalization occurred, China had basically a very similar system. It's been communist since 1949, as a matter of fact. So it is the same, although there have been some changes, it is basically the same basic ideology in China. The China of 1972, however, is obviously not the same as the China of 2022. It is, now a global superpower, which obviously it was not at the time of normalization in 1972. And the growing capabilities of China, the growing resources, a foreign policy that is, of course, much more active. It now has a foreign policy which is that of a superpower, which is, again, not what you saw in the 1970s. So for that reason, this is also one of the reasons that the Japanese policymakers and Japanese people have changed their perceptions of China in the last 50 years. Now, that doesn't mean that we cannot go back to a more fruitful relationship, mutually beneficial relationship, like the other guests have spoken about before. But it's also simply important to understand that the context of 50 years ago is different than that of today. And then that also explains why we have a different view, why Japanese people have a different view. So the United States, yes, does play a role, but it's not the only factor for this reason.
Yuntao, we know like U.S. Speaker of House Nancy Pelosi visited Japan with Taiwan, created this strong provocation and strong response from the mainland. And then you see Japan probably is the only Asian country criticizing the Chinese response and also sent their delegation with their basically parliamentary members to Taiwan. Of course, again, that was seen as offense for the Chinese side. That's a violation of the One China policy. Obviously, One China policy has been the foundation of the relationship between China and the U.S. and also China with Japan. Tell us, the different, how China see this issue and how serious it is to a China-Japan relationship.
Well, as we have already emphasized that the One China principle has been the most important political foundation between China and Japan since 50 years ago, and it remains the case today. And it became particularly sensitive today due to what you have said, the U.S. policy, the U.S. changing policies on the Taiwan question, culminated in Senator Pelosi's the visit to Taiwan. So I think that Japan was, in this case, caught in a dilemma. On the one hand, it wanted to follow the United States, strengthen its alliance with the United States vis-a-vis China, while on the other hand, it will face China's criticism and raises the risk of deteriorating the relationship with China. So I think that the Japanese politicians who follow the United States in trying to challenging the One China principle actually is doing damage to Japan's own national interests by adding more uncertainty to this region by, let's say, raising risks between China and Japan over the Taiwan question. So I think that that is why the two countries, not only politicians, governments, but everyone should stick to the One China principle when managing their relations. And I think the wise people in both countries understand the importance of this question and would, I hope, sincerely hope that the two governments can steer this bilateral relationship forward by managing these political differences and sensitivities in a more rational and careful manner.
Benoit, if you look at the numbers, for example, in 2020, for the first time in 2 years, China surpassed the U.S. as the #1 market or destination for Japanese goods. And in the first quarter of 2022, this year, China's imports of Japanese merchandise reached a record high. Obviously, there's a continued trend of so-called hot economics and the cold politics, and also in the message exchanged between Chinese leaders and Japanese leaders on this 50th anniversary, both sides basically said, China-Japan relations is key to promoting peace and prosperity within the region and the world. And the Japanese Prime Minister Kishida said that, talked about building constructive bilateral ties. 30 seconds. So the future of the relationship?
Well, I think the future of the relationship will depend on many, many factors. I think their economic relationship will continue to grow. Since 1972, it's been growing tremendously, astronomically, as a matter of fact. I think a lot of it will depend also on the relationship between China and the United States. That will obviously influence Japan's relations with China. But there are other issues as well. The East China Sea will influence the relationship a lot. But I see hope for cooperation on several factors. There can be cooperation on many issues that will bring about stability or contribute to bringing about stability in the region. So there's problems, but it's not all dark for the future. That's how I will end this.
Yeah, on that note, we conclude today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.